Hello, everyone. Happy World Bee Day. We are very excited to have David Mizejewski joining us again today for another awesome live stream. David is the naturalist at the National Wildlife Federation. This is the third live stream he's done with us, so hopefully you've seen his face before. We learn a lot of great information about planting native. You get to ask questions live in the chat, and we're going to do a quick presentation all about native bees because there's a lot to learn there. And then we'll answer your questions live after the presentation. So very excited to have everyone joining us today. I see you all posting in the chat where you're joining from. It looks like everyone in the country is here today, which is amazing. We've got California, Illinois, North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland. I'm in Maryland. So I'm Julie, the marketing director of Garden for Wildlife. We're based in Maryland. David's also on the East Coast. But if you have questions about Midwest, West Coast, we are happy to try to answer those as well. So I'm going to hand it over to David. David has a great presentation ready for us today. And as you have questions, feel free to post those in the chat, and then we'll pull those later.
Brilliant. David. Well, thank you. Thank you, Julie. Thank you for inviting me back. I love coming and talking to folks about native plants and wildlife and the connections and all of the National Wildlife Federation's work in this space of gardening for wildlife. Today, my presentation is in celebration of World Bee Day, as you mentioned, and it's got a little bit of a fun title. It's called Everything You Think You Know About Bees is Wrong. So we're going to have a fun little quiz. I'm going to talk all about, why bees are interesting, why they're special, why they're really important pollinators. I'm going to cover a lot of stuff. So I'm going to dive in and go pretty quickly. For folks that maybe have watched my previous live streams here, the beginning part might be a little bit of a refresher for you, but for new folks, I wanted to include the introduction so that they get the full package here. So I'm going to dive right into my slides. All right, actually, give me 1 second because it's giving me a weird message on when I click share the screen here. So here we go. Technology. All right. Can everybody see that? Julie, give me a nod if you can see the slides. There we go. All right, brilliant. All right, so everything you think you know about bees is wrong. Again, we're going to explain exactly what I mean by that. And we do have a little fun interactive quiz. So let's get into it. First, I want to let you guys know that I have a book. It's called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. Most of what I'm going to talk about today is included in the book. So, don't feel like you have to take, copious notes. You can sit back and just listen and absorb. And if you want to pick up the book, you'll have all the information. I mentioned that, and Julie mentioned that I am a naturalist with the National Wildlife Federation. And so just to kick us off, I always like to let folks know what the National Wildlife Federation is all about. We're one of the oldest and largest wildlife conservation and education organizations. We're a nonprofit organization, and this is our mission: to unite all Americans to ensure that wildlife and people thrive in a rapidly changing world. We do that work in all sorts of ways. Working in Washington, D.C. for strong wildlife protection laws like the Endangered Species Act that, basically saved the animal on your screen, the bald eagle, from extinction. We're working in all across the country with our partners and state affiliates to work on wildlife, like reintroducing bison to their native grassland habitat, building the largest highway overpass in the Los Angeles ecosystem for mountain lions and other wildlife. Back east, we're working with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, our affiliate, to help the endangered red wolf, of which there's only like 20 left in the wild, and so on and so forth. We also publish Ranger Rick magazine, and we have all sorts of programs directed at helping kids get the access to nature so that they can explore it and hopefully grow up into adults that care about it. And of course, we do a lot of work in this garden for wildlife space. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But the wildlife species I all mentioned are kind of what we tend to think of as wildlife, right? The eagles and the bears and the wolves and the mountain lions and bison, right? But this animal is actually wildlife. It's an animal. It's a bee. It's a kind of bumblebee. We're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail later. It's the rusty-patched bumblebee, but it's an insect. And I want to emphasize this. Insects are wildlife. They're not plants. They're not fungus. They're not bacteria. They're animals. even though we often don't think of them as such. And so that's a really important thing when it comes to understanding why planting with natives and creating natural gardens is really important, because insects happen to be a group of wildlife that many, collectively, they are very dependent on plants. And they're a group of wildlife that can really benefit by how we choose to take care of our own piece of the earth, our own yards or other garden spaces. So insects are wildlife. And that is partially why the National Wildlife Federation founded the Garden for Wildlife movement in the US over 50 years ago. All the way back in 1973, we launched this initiative to help people create natural gardens and landscapes to support not only the insects like the bees, but also the songbirds and the butterflies and the frogs and the turtles and all the other wildlife species that can safely share our habitat with us if we just give them some habitat, right? And so a lot of times, though, there's a little bit of a disconnect between why a wildlife conservation group is in the garden business, right? And so this is really the main reason why. It's because plants are the foundation of the food web. You can see the robin here eating some berries. That's a pretty clear, visual of how plants are supporting wildlife. And after the plants are providing the seeds, the nuts, the berries, the nectar, the sap, the pollen, the nectar, all the ways that the plants are feeding wildlife, those animals that eat plants then become food for other animals. So that's really what the food web, the food chain is all about. After plants, the next critical level of the food web are those insects. That's one of the reasons why insects are so important in the food web, because lots of other things rely on them as a food source. So just for one example, all of our backyard birds, all of the upland terrestrial birds in North America, 96% of them rely on insects and other invertebrates as the only food source for their babies. So that's what's happening right now. The birds are nesting, and almost all of the bird species that you're going to encounter in your yards, in your communities, are feeding their babies insects, other than the raptors or some unique examples like goldfinches or mourning doves, which are feeding their baby seeds. Most of the birds are feeding themselves insects. So insects are really important as part of the food web, in addition to many of them being pollinators, which we're going to talk a lot about today. Now, 90% plus of the insects that use plants for some part of their life cycle as a food source or as a host plant, 90% of them can only survive on plants that they evolved with, that they co-evolved with, that they share an evolutionary history with. And so this is really important when it comes to designing garden spaces, because you want to pick those plants that are going to support the most amount of insects and other wildlife. And that brings us to native plants. Now, if you're here, you probably are already familiar with what native plants are, but just for a quick review, native plants are the indigenous plants of your region. They've been here for tens of thousands, maybe even millions of years in some cases. And as a result, they're great choices for the garden because they are adapted to your local soils, to your local climate conditions, to the local weather patterns that result from the climate conditions, the precipitation, the moisture, all of those things. And that makes them generally pretty hardy and resilient and low maintenance once they get established in your garden. And of course, the native plants are the key to supporting the local wildlife, because the plants and the animals, they're like two pieces of a puzzle. They co-evolve together, and in many cases, they can't survive without the other. So when you remove the native plants, which unfortunately is what we've done, you also remove the wildlife. But the good news is, if you put the native plants back, we can begin to restore the health of those ecosystems, because the wildlife will start to return. And that's really what this is all about. And this is why a wildlife conservation organization has a garden program. Because if you think about it, the definition of gardening is planting something with a purpose. So, if you're planting tomatoes and eggplants and squash because you like to eat them, you're a vegetable gardener, or more accurately, a fruit gardener, because all of those things are technically botanically fruits. But if you're planting native plants because you want to support the birds and the butterflies and the bees, then that makes you a wildlife gardener. And that's the whole idea behind this concept of garden for wildlife. So all species really need four things to survive. And these are the things you want to think about providing through your garden space. And they're natural sources of food, water source, cover or shelter, and then places or resources for reproduction and raising young. These are the four things that we at the National Wildlife Federation encourage you to create in your garden space. And when you do, and you commit to maintaining your garden in sort of a natural, sustainable way, that is how you can achieve certified wildlife habitat status for your yard or your garden. This is the recognition program. I'll tell you a little bit more about it at the very end. So let's get into it. Let's meet the pollinators. Now, I think probably everybody here is aware that bees are pollinators, but I want to take one step back before we do the deep dive into the bees to just talk about pollination and what it is and some of the other animals in addition to bees that are out there doing it. So pollination or pollinators are animals that visit flowers, and they visit them to get a food reward in the form of nectar or sometimes pollen. And in doing so, they get coated in that pollen, which is the reproductive material of the plant, the male reproductive material. Plants can't move around the way that animals can to go find a mate, right? So through this, again, process of coevolution, they have basically figured out how to trick the animals into doing the work for them, into moving that pollen from one flower to another so that it will fertilize that second flower. And in doing so, it allows the plants to reproduce. And so pollinators are incredibly essential for functioning ecosystems. I really can't overstate this. Life on this planet as we know it would be radically different if pollinators all disappeared. In fact, life as we know it would probably end. It's that important. And so again, pollinators, by moving that pollen and fertilizing plants, not only allow the plant to, make their seeds, which allow the plant species to reproduce and spread, but many plants also package their seeds in little edible packages, like seeds or like nuts, fruits, berries, things like that. And those are designed to attract a whole other group of wildlife, like birds and mammals, to come eat them and digest the seed, and then they poop it out. The seed survives that process, and then it can germinate away from the parent plant. So these native plants are pretty clever, in figuring out strategies, not only to reproduce, but also to spread their seeds, all by using animals. And so again, without the services of pollinators, many other animals all along the food web would not have any food to eat. And that includes us. About a third of all the food we eat is the result, either directly or indirectly, from animal pollinators. So that's pretty huge if you think about it. And so that brings us to, who are the pollinators? So again, bees are pollinators, and they're pretty important ones. But wasps are also pollinators. You may or may not know that bees actually evolved from wasps. The wasps were around first. And then sometime all the way back during the Jurassic period, when dinosaurs were running around, flowering plants started to evolve and started to appear. And some wasps figured out that instead of having to go out and hunt insects, because most wasp species are predators in addition to pollinators, those wasp species figured out that they could actually get food resources right out of those flowers in the form of pollen and nectar. And that group of wasps eventually evolved into bees. So, it's kind of neat. They're related, and bees are, if you think about it, they're kind of like vegetarian versions of wasps. So bees are pollinators, wasps are pollinators. There are many fly species that are pollinators. And you might look at this animal on the screen and think, oh, wait, isn't that a bee? Look at it. It's black and yellow. But what's interesting is we're going to talk a little bit more about the whole black and yellow thing. But this is a fly that's actually a bee or wasp mimic, because, as we know, bees and wasps can sting. And so by looking like them, the fly gets a little bit of added protection from predators. And so, but anyway, this is a kind of fly called a syrphid fly or a flower fly. And there's a whole bunch of fly species that are pollinators, including mosquitoes. Now, I'm under no delusion that you're going to love mosquitoes after I tell you this, but mosquitoes are indeed pollinators. It's actually only the female mosquito that seeks out blood, and that's only when she needs to lay eggs. Otherwise, mosquitoes are feeding on flower nectar, and they are indeed pollinators. Now, thankfully, they are very minor pollinators, and there really aren't any plants that are, that they're an obligate pollinator for. So I'm not saying we should attract pollinators or mosquitoes. In fact, we should deter them, but that's a whole other talk. But, the more you know, And I'm a naturalist, and it's my job to, sort of break down nature and let people know what it's all about. So I feel it's my duty to let you know that mosquitoes are pollinators. Other pollinators include beetles and bugs. These are actually two separate groups of insects. Not all insects technically are bugs, but you can see the longhorn beetle there. It's on a flower. It's actually a wild rose flower. So there are many beetle and bug species that are pollinators. Butterflies, of course, are pollinators, as you probably already knew. So are moths, like this hummingbird clearwing moth, one of our showier day-flying moths, and you can see it drinking out of a bee balm plant there. There are even some ant species that act as pollinators. This is one of them, and unfortunately, it's a preserved specimen because it's hard to get a picture of an ant pollinating, but there are a few ant species that act as pollinators. Similarly, some spiders are pollinators too, indirectly. They're not visiting the flower to drink the nectar or gather the pollen, but this crab spider here, you can see, again, is evolved to be camouflaged in yellow flowers. And, indirectly, it is moving a little bit of pollen around while it's doing that. So yeah, those are the insect and invertebrate and pollinators that we have here in North America. Other North American pollinators include hummingbirds. And this is a great picture that really illustrates that idea of two pieces of a puzzle. If you look at that coral honeysuckle flower, that's our native honeysuckle over much of the eastern US. It is designed to accommodate the long beak of the hummingbird. The nectar's all the way down at the base. The hummingbird has this long beak and a long tongue with a feathery tip designed to fit right into that flower. But if you look, since we're talking about pollination, look underneath the head of that hummingbird. You can see those are the anthers, and those at the tips of them are where the pollen is, and it's brushing the chin of that hummingbird. Now, when that hummingbird goes over to the next flower on the next plant, some of that pollen is going to rub off on the female parts of the flower and fertilize it so that that honeysuckle can reproduce. It's a good example, again, of how our pollinators in particular, our native wildlife pollinators and the native plants that they visit, again, are two pieces of a puzzle, and you really can't have one without the other. And then lastly, there are actually some bats here in North America. So if you live in Arizona or New Mexico or parts of West Texas, you might actually have these guys flying around. There's 3 species of bats that are nectar feeders, and they tend to visit, things like agave, cacti, things like that. And you can see the long tongue there, and they actually act as pollinators too. In other parts of the world, there are other animals. There are some frogs. There are some possums that act as pollinators, but the ones that I just covered are the ones that we have here in North America. But let's bring it back to our subject at hand here. Because of their sheer numbers, there's about 20,000 species of bees on the planet. And here in North America, we have roughly about 4,000 of them, partly because of their numbers, but also because they are just so, again, perfectly co-evolved by their body shape, by their fuzziness, by special structures that they have on their body to move pollen from one flower to another. It makes bees probably, as a group, the most important because they are the most numerous and also the most efficient pollinators of our plants. So they're pretty important animals, especially when you go back to what I was saying about how critical pollination is for the functioning of most of the ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems anyway, on this planet that support us as well as all the other wildlife species. All right, here's the fun part. So we're going to do a little quiz. And this is where the title of my talk comes from. I call it Everything You Think You Know About Bees is Wrong. And there's a little hint in the title here. So let's have a little bit of fun with this. I'm going to show a series of true or false questions. You guys can feel free to drop your answers in the chat if you like. I'm not going to be grading anybody on any of this, but this is all in good fun. So let's get to our first question here. True or false, bees have black and yellow stripes or black and yellow coloration? Remember, I mentioned a minute ago we would come back to this. What do you think?
Is it cheating if I weigh in on the quiz?
No, go ahead. Do you mean answer in the chat? Or do you want to answer out loud?
Well, I don't know. What if I spoil all the answers by answering out loud?
Okay. Well, I'll let you make that call, but let's go on to the answer to this. So
we're getting mixed responses in the chat. So
okay, which I expected. Yeah.
Yeah.
The answer is false. again, we've got 20,000 species of bees on this planet, and certainly there are species that do have that, stereotypical bee look. If at least some bees and wasps did not have that, black and yellow or brown and yellow striping pattern, those mimic flies would not look like that, right? But in reality, there are many different ways that bees can appear. So you can see the metallic green sweat bee there, that beautiful golden bee in the middle, the black bee with yellow legs. There's all sorts of diversity in the bee world. In fact, you've probably seen some of these bees flying around in your yard, and you might not have had any idea that it was a bee, because in your mind you were thinking, oh, bees, have that striping. And so many bees don't. They look very, very different from that stereotypical view of a bee. All right, next question. True or false? Bees live in hives and have a queen. Go ahead and put your answers in the chat. Be curious.
I don't know if you're going to stump these guys, David. We got a lot of really smart people in the chat today.
Yeah, I'm not actually looking at the chat, so thank you for letting me know that people are putting answers in there. It does not surprise me that people that are participating today probably know the answers to a lot of these. The answer is also false. Here's the thing. Of those 20,000 bees, around 90% of them do not live, they're not social. They do not live in hives, and they don't have queens. They are solitary. So what that means is that it's one individual female bee that is forming a nest. And again, we're going to talk in more detail about what those nests or egg-laying tunnels are all about. But most of our bee species do not live in hives, and they do not have queens. All right, next question. True or false? Bees make honey.
This one's tripping you right into a conversation that's already started in the chat around honeybees. So
okay, all right. Yeah, well, we're gonna talk about the honeybees. So the answer is false. Most bees don't make honey, and the reason, just to sort of again unpack this, right? Some bees make honey, and it's the bees that are social, right? So they live in hives. They have this whole worker structure. They've got a queen, and they're caring for their larvae in there. And so honey is a food to feed the hive. So if you were a solitary bee and you don't have a hive, there's no point in making honey, right? So the majority, again, 90% or so of the bees on this planet do not make honey. All right, next question. True or false? Bees sting. What do you think? I know some of you probably have personal experience with this that will be fueling your answer. True or false?
I've definitely been stung by bees. That's true.
I have too. But the answer, again, I'm going to give it a false. And that is because though in most bee species, the females can sting, there is a group of stingless bees that they don't sting. And the reason it's female bees that sting is that the stinger is actually a modified ovipositor, which is the structure on an insect that female insects use to lay eggs. And so in bees, it's only the females that have those. And so therefore, it's only the females that can sting. But again, we're going to go back to this solitary reproductive behavior. So solitary bees, most of them, the females do have stingers. But think about why a bee would sting you. A bee, you're way bigger than a bee. A bee is not trying to eat you. It's not going to come after you unless it sees you as a threat. And what would make a bee feel threatened? Well, if you have a whole hive there with your queen, which is the heartbeat of the whole hive, and you've got all of the babies that you're caring for, and you've got this store of honey that you have worked so hard to collect nectar and make the honey, you're going to be pretty defensive, aren't you? Right? So if you are a social bee and you have the hive to protect, you're going to be a little bit more aggressive and maybe more likely to sting. But again, 90% of our bees do not live that way, right? They're solitary. And these bees, these females, don't stick around, and they don't protect their eggs or their babies. They don't make honey. So they have no real motivation. So unless you really go after them, unless you like pick them up in your hand and try to squish them, the chances of getting stung by these bees is incredibly, incredibly small. So I'm going with false for this one. All right, last quiz question is true or false? Bees visit all kinds of flowers.
I feel like this one's going to trip me up.
Well, think about it. Think about it, and
I know they visit the native ones, David.
that is true. They do. Let's go to our answer on this one. Again, it is a false. So certainly, yeah, some bees can visit a whole wide diversity of different kinds of flowers in order to get their nectar and the pollen. Um, and this is one thing that I think probably of all the things I'm going to talk about tonight, this is probably the thing that I think the average person knows the least about. And it's that about a third of our bee species are pollen specialists, which the technical term for that is oligolectic, one of my favorite words. Say it with me, oligolectic. You can walk away from this live stream with learning a new word maybe. And so oligolectic basically means that these bees can only collect the pollen from certain plants. Now, bees, they drink flower nectar. In some cases, they'll use that flower nectar to make honey. They also are collecting the pollen deliberately. It's not just accidental, right? Because pollen is the protein source that they feed to their babies. And in some cases, they'll mix it with nectar and they'll make something called bee bread or a bee loaf, and that's what they'll feed their babies. And sometimes the adults eat that as well. But for these oligolectic bees, they can only feed on the pollen of certain plants. And there's even ones that are more specific called monolectic that can only feed on the pollen of one kind of plant. And so a good chunk of our bee species basically have these host plants. It's very similar to how butterflies and moths have host plants for their caterpillars that are the only plants that those caterpillars can eat. And without those plants in the landscape, any of these insects that need host plants, and again, go back to the beginning when I was telling you that 90% of our insect species that rely on plants can only use the native plants, right? This is an example of that. So 1/3 of our bee species are these pollen specialists, and they require for reproduction native plants specifically. If they're not there, these bees cannot exist in the area. So I know this was maybe a little bit of a trick question quiz, and some of you are probably being, well, yeah, but all of these were not true and false. They were kind of yes, maybe. But the reason that I framed it that way is that all of those things that I just asked you about, are bees black and yellow? Do they live in hives? Do they have queens? Do they make honey? Do bees sting? Do bees visit all sorts of different flowers? These are all true of one kind of bee, the honeybee. And I framed the quiz specifically to be a little bit frustrating for people because I'm trying to flip the narrative, right? Because most people believe all of those things are true of all bees, and they're totally fine, operating under that false assumption that, because this one kind of bee that they know about, the honeybee, it's true for, that it must be true of all bees. So I just flipped it on its head and said, none of those things are true about bees because they're not true for 90% plus of our bee species. So thank you for being good sports about that. But here's the thing. Most people know about the honeybee, and honeybees are totally unlike the majority of other bee species on the planet. Now, why do we only know about the honeybee? Well, the honeybee is an important bee. It's agriculturally important. The honeybee is really, really important for pollinating a lot of our crops. But here's the thing, is that here in North America anyway, honeybees are not wildlife. Honeybees are a domesticated species. They were brought over by European immigrants when they came to this continent for their pollination services, for their production of honey and beeswax, right? And to this day, we continue to use them, but they really are livestock. Honeybees are basically the equivalent of cows and chickens in the bee world, right? And so for those of us that work in wildlife conservation, we're really focused on our native bees, on the wild bee species, just in the same way that, at National Wildlife Federation, we're reintroducing bison to their native grassland habitat. We're not worried about, heritage breed cows, right? And we're working on, protecting the sage grouse, and we're not really doing any work in the space of, domesticated chickens, right? It's the same thing. So honeybees, largely, almost the majority of honeybees in North America live in managed hives by people as livestock. Yes, there are feral hives that are out there, but anyway, I'm emphasizing this because, again, it really, if you want to help bees, it's really important to know the differences between actual wild bees and these domesticated honeybees. Because, again, these wild bees are actual wildlife, and critically, many of our native bee species are disappearing right before our eyes, and nobody knows anything about it because no one's talking about it. And so that's what I'm here. It's really, if you walk away with nothing from this presentation tonight, I hope it's this, that we have these incredibly diverse native bees here in North America, again, around 4,000 species, and they're doing the work of pollinating plants in nature. It's not the honeybees that are doing that. Honeybees are pollinating our crops. It's these wild native bees that are keeping the ecosystem running by pollinating all of those flowering plants out there that are fueling the entire food web that not only is supporting all the other wildlife species, but guess what? It supports us too. So it's really, really a critical point here, is that we need to be learning more, understanding more, and doing more conservation work centered around our wild native bee species, not the honeybee, which, by the way, is not going extinct. The commercial honeybee industry has faced some challenges. You might have heard of colony collapse disorder. There's various mites and other pathogens that, have periodically knocked down the honeybee population, but they're not going anywhere. We are breeding them, we're protecting them, all of that. And again, they're not wildlife anyway, at least not here in North America. So let's talk a little bit about what is driving the disappearance of our wild native bee species. It's the, sort of the familiar laundry list of human-caused things that are knocking so many of our native bees down in population, sometimes to the point of extinction. So incredible use of pesticides, diseases, some of which, unfortunately, are spread by honeybees to wild bee species. Climate change is the big overarching thing that is affecting, most life on this planet. Introduction of invasive non-native species, again, the honeybee, and just, all of that collectively leads to massive habitat loss. And so think about it. In the US, we've got about 40 million acres of lawn where we dump about 80 million tons of pesticides. Now, number one, that lawn is not providing habitat for anybody. It's the month of May. In addition to this being World Bee Day, it's also Garden for Wildlife Month. I forgot to mention that at the top. But there's this thing called No Mow May that you might have heard about. That's this campaign to, encourage people to lay off mowing their lawns for a month and let it grow a little bit more wild and natural. And that's actually a great first step. It can really reduce lawnmower pollution. But the reality is that lawns are still not habitat, even if they're overgrown. So, and think about how ubiquitous lawns are in our cities, our towns, and our neighborhoods. They're everywhere. And they've replaced the once diverse native plant communities that used to be there. And then we do the double whammy of not only removing the native plants and replacing them with lawn, then we dump all these pesticides on them. It's really bad. And it's the reason why so many wildlife species, one of the reasons anyway, are disappearing. A little bit more on some of these pesticides. So insecticides are a group of pesticides that kill insects specifically. Neonicotinoids are what we call systemic insecticides. So when a plant is treated with it, all parts of the plant become toxic to all insects. It's a broad spectrum kind of thing. It's not just targeted towards one group of insects. And so all parts of the plants, including the nectar and the pollen. And sadly, neonicotinoids are the widest or most widely used class of insecticides today. So it becomes really important for you as a consumer, when you're buying plants, to ask if they have been treated with systemic pesticides, even if you don't remember the word neonicotinoids. There's your second vocabulary word. And I'm happy to report that all of the plants from Garden for Wildlife are not treated with this kind of insecticide. So it's an important thing to keep in mind when you're plant shopping. Another big source of insecticides are people hiring companies to spray insecticides to kill mosquitoes. This is a terrible thing to do. I know mosquitoes suck, literally, right? But when you spray these broad spectrum insecticides, that means that they will kill all insects. And that is what they are. You're not only killing the mosquitoes, but you are killing the butterflies, you are killing the fireflies, you are killing the dragonflies, you are killing the ladybugs, and you are killing the bees, regardless of what the company's marketing say, that these are, pollinators safe. It's just not true. So please try to avoid doing that. There are many better ways to avoid getting, bitten by mosquitoes. I cover them in my book, the National Wildlife Federation. We have a whole series of blog posts on that. I don't have time to get into that right now. So that's some of the pesticide impact. This series of images that I'm about to show you is looking at climate change and some documented impacts on some of our Western bumblebee species. So this is the historic, sort of thermally tolerable habitat for these bumblebee species. This is where the species ranges. It's almost a perfect overlap, right? No surprise there, right? Like these animals thrive in the habitat that has the right climate for them. Well, here's what's happening is that thermally tolerable habitat has shifted northward. But unfortunately, the bees themselves have not been able to make that shift. So what's resulted is, as the climate has changed, and this is just in the last few decades, the range of these bees, the available habitat for them, has shrunk down. And they have not, for whatever reason, scientists are still studying this and trying to understand why aren't the bees migrating north along with the shift in climate. And so, it's sort of climate change impacts happening right before our eyes. And so we come back to the rusty patched bumblebee that I mentioned at the very beginning, and that was our poster bee for the quiz. The rusty patched bumblebee has the dubious distinction of being the first North American bee species to actually be listed as an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. This is a bee that used to be really common throughout parts of the upper Midwest and the Northeast and down through the Mid-Atlantic. And it's now gone from at least 87% of its range because of all of the things I've been talking about. There are other bee species, though, that are rapidly disappearing. Many of them bumblebees, actually. The Western bumblebee, disappearing. The American bumblebee, disappearing. The Franklin's bumblebee might actually already be extinct. We're not sure. It hasn't been seen in quite a while. So, and for many of our wild native bee species, we don't even know their population status because there hasn't been the research and the science and the study to actually figure that out. But you can guess that probably a lot of them are also disappearing. And so to wrap the depressing part of my talk, here's a little bit of morbid humor. I found this picture somewhere online, and I don't have a credit for it, unfortunately, but it is, sort of morbidly true for all the reasons that I've been talking about the critical importance of pollinators for life on this planet, pollinating all the flowering plants that fuel the ecosystem. And again, we know that bees are the most important of our animal pollinators out there. And, it really is true. We are connected. We humans, despite thinking we're above it or separate, are part of nature. We rely on it for our very survival. And if we destroy key elements of it, like pollinators, like bees, we're going to suffer. We're going to feel the impact of it. All right, that's the end of the depressing part. Now let's talk about my favorite part, which is how we can all help bees, help them face some of these challenges, help them turn the tide so that we can continue to have healthy wild bee populations. And you guys, it's so simple. Plant flowers. Flowers equal food for bees. Again, they're eating the flower nectar the nectar that flower is producing. They're collecting the pollen. They're feeding their babies their pollen. And so that's pretty much it. Like, that's how you help bees at the front line. Restore their habitat. Again, all of those things, pesticides, disease, invasive species, climate change, all lead to habitat loss, right? So how do we restore habitat? We put flowering plants back into the landscape, because that is what is the food source for bees. And of course, native plants are best for all of the reasons we've been talking about. Many of our bee species rely specifically on natives. If those are not there, they cannot exist in the landscape. And even the generalist bees, the ones that can visit all sorts of different flowers, maybe even including non-natives, they still do need the native plants as well. So that's the very first thing. That's how you're going to provide that, going back to those elements of habitat: food, water, cover, places to raise young. This is how you're going to feed the bees. You can also offer water. That's the second component of habitat. Now, in the picture here are honeybees, but I like it because you can see their little tongues coming out. And honeybees actually do collect water and bring it back to their hive. And when it's really hot out, I don't know what the temperature is like where you are. I'm in New Jersey. We've been having like a weird spring heat wave. It's been in the 90s already. Not fun. So the bees, when their hives are getting overheated, the honeybees, they'll take that water back and buzz their wings and release it, and it evaporates. And it's basically like air conditioning. It's kind of neat. But even some of our native bee species do rely on water. So, insects have a tough time with large bodies of water because if they fall on it, they can get trapped by the surface tension and drown. So you can do like a bird bath, like this picture here, and just put some rocks in it. It gives bees landing places, and should they actually fall in, it's pretty easy for them to climb out. So that's how you can provide a water source for bees. So that's food and water. Those are the first two components of habitat. Cover is pretty much just planting the natives, right? The bees are going to hide out and hang out in those native plants. So let's skip to the third or the fourth component of habitat: places to raise young. So how do we provide that for bees? Again, most of which, 90%, are not forming hives. So where are they nesting? So of that 90% of solitary bees that do not live in hives, roughly 2/3 of them, 3/4 in that ballpark, are nesting in tunnels in the ground. So what you can do is try to leave some bare patches, especially if you have loose, sandier type soils. That's what a lot of these ground nesting bees are looking for. And even if you can't actually provide that habitat, you might you create it yourself. You might already be providing it just without you doing anything. So I guess my message there is, if you do see these solitary bees going into tunnels in the ground, please do not cover it up, and please do not spray pesticides on it. Just leave them be. No pun intended. Because a lot of people panic, they freak out, they think, oh, these bees are going to sting me, or they're wasps. And I should mention that yellow jackets are a kind of wasp, and they do tend to nest in the ground. But again, they are social insects, so they are forming hives, and they have a queen, and they have larvae, and they are pretty aggressive in protecting that. So how do you tell the difference? Well, I mean, the wasps generally look different. They're not as fuzzy as bees. They're a little bit more sharp looking. But the big thing would be that if you see a hole in the ground and lots of these yellow and black flying insects coming out of it, that is not a solitary bee. Most likely it's a yellow jacket. If you see an individual tunnel and one little bee going in, like this minor bee here, then that's a bee, and you should leave it alone. And sometimes, by the way, the solitary bees will nest in close proximity to each other, but it's still one individual female bee. And I didn't mention this yet, but what she's doing is she will go into that tunnel and she will lay an egg in it, and then she will make a little ball of pollen and nectar, again called bee bread or a bee loaf. She leaves that with the egg, and then she builds a little wall. And then she'll make a series of little chambers in the tunnel until that tunnel is full. And that's it. Then she goes away and she dies. She doesn't protect, like I mentioned. She doesn't sit around waiting to sting you if you come close. Those little baby bees are on their own. They hatch, they eat the bee loaf, they pupate, and then eventually they will emerge as adult bees, oftentimes not until the following year, depending on what bee species it is and how late they're active. And these solitary bees are not generally active year round. They have a window of time where they are active. And that window of time is the time when their native plants that they are relying on for pollen are blooming. That's the only window that they can reproduce. So we have some of these native bees that are active in the early spring, like the mason bees, for example, some that are not active until midsummer, like leafcutter bees, for example. And again, they're only active for a short window, a few weeks out of the year. And otherwise, they're an egg, a pupa, or a larva, in these tunnels, most of which, again, 3/4 of which are going to be in tunnels in the ground. The other quarter or so of the bees that are solitary are nesting in dead plants. So we have a saying at the National Wildlife Federation: dead plants are full of life. This is one of the reasons why we say that. So if you have a fallen tree like this, or a dead or dying tree, woodpeckers are drilling into it. Maybe there's termites in there, carpenter ants. There's all of these animals are making tunnels that our native bees will then use. These solitary bees that are not ground nesters, they will either go into the tunnels in the dead or dying wood, or they will go into the dead stems of your perennial. So I'm giving you permission on this slide to throw out a very common conventional gardening rule. And that is, when the fall comes and your perennial plants die on the top parts, their roots stay alive and they'll resprout in the spring. Conventional gardening says, oh, that's ugly, cut them down. Don't do that. Here's what you should do instead. Leave those dead stems standing. If they were pollinated, and hopefully they were, those stems are typically seed heads. And so the birds are going to feed on those seeds all through the winter. So there's your natural bird feeder. Then come spring, before things really, really leaf out, what you can do is you can start to cut some of those stems back a little bit, but you want to leave them standing anywhere between 8 and 24 inches. And a diversity of heights is best to maximize the attractiveness to the most kinds of different bee species, right? Those bees, those solitary stem nesting bees, are then going to have somewhere where they can lay their eggs. And yeah, aesthetically, it's going to look a little bit, scraggly for a minute. But once the green growth starts, trust me, it's going to, explode, and it will cover those, dead looking stems pretty rapidly. And then those stems are still there for the summer nesting bees, and you just leave them standing year round, and the plant grows and comes down, and you're going to be providing nesting habitat for this whole group of bees. So it's a pretty simple thing. We can all do this. So leave your dead logs, if you have them, add them to your yard. Leave your dead stems standing through the winter, cut them back in varying heights in the spring, and then you'll be providing places to raise young for our solitary bees. You can also add mud, and yes, this is my old backyard in Washington, D.C., and yes, my friends were like, what are you doing? But these bees use mud, many of them anyway, to build the little chamber walls in their tunnels. And incidentally, other animals like robins and phoebes, they also use mud to build their nests. So mud is a little valuable resource. So make a little, this is a flower pot drainage dish. I mix some clayey mud. You don't want to have standing water because that will attract mosquitoes. But the bees will come and collect this and use it in their tunnels for their nests. Now you might have. Well, I'm sure you not might. Most of you probably are familiar that you can buy bee nesting blocks or bee nesting houses that provide nesting tunnels. Now, you can do that, but I would recommend, unless you are really, really devoted to it, because it is a lot of work and maintenance if you're going to do it right, you should just skip this and just focus on providing the natural habitat. If you're going to do this right, you need to really be monitoring. You need to be harvesting the bee cocoons, disinfecting them, because parasites can build up in these, because they are unnatural concentrations of nesting tubes. Even though some native bees will nest, in close proximity to each other, it's never this dense. And so parasites can build up in these. Predators like woodpeckers can easily get into them. But anyway, if you're going to keep the parasites down, you have to collect them, disinfect them, store them in your fridge at a proper humidity. It's a lot of work. So unless you're dedicated to doing that, and if you are, by all means, go for it. But for most people, I think it's probably too much. And I would just focus on the natural habitat. So coming back to dead plants are full of life, in the fall, keep your leaves on your property if you can. Use them as a natural mulch, as nature intended them to be. And all sorts of wildlife species, so many wildlife species, use those fallen leaves as habitat. They will naturally break down and compost in place and return their nutrients right to the root zone of your plants. They also will suppress weeds. They'll retain soil moisture. They really are natural mulch and fertilizer. But the reason I bring it up here is that many of our bumblebees rely on the fallen leaf layer. So bumblebees are social bees, our native bumblebees. They do live in hives. They do have queens. They do make a limited amount of honey. And so at the end of the year, the hive is going to shut down, right? And most of those workers are going to die when the weather gets cold. But the new queen at the end of the year will emerge, she'll mate, and then she will bury herself in a tunnel underneath the fallen leaves that act as insulation. So our native bumblebees need that leaf layer in order to overwinter. So that's another really critical thing that we can all be doing, is keeping those leaves on our property, use them as natural mulch in our beds, and that will provide overwintering spots for honeybees. Another thing we can all do is stop using the pesticides. We can all do this. There are many, many, many tried and true organic gardening techniques that won't put our bees at risk, or frankly, all the other insects or all of the other wildlife. And this is when most people see this picture, they, at least from a conventional gardening perspective, are going to look at this and be like, oh, something's eating my plants. I got to spray it, right? Well, no, because what you're actually looking at are signs of leafcutter bees. As their name suggests, what they do is the female bees, these are solitary nesting bees that will nest in the little tunnels, right? And so what they'll do is, instead of using mud as their chamber wall, they will cut little round pieces of leaves like you see in this picture here, and they will use those as the chamber separator. So I share this as an awareness thing, right? Because what looks like might be insect damage really is not. It's actually a function. It's a sign that you have a functioning pollinator population where you are. And if you were to spray it, it would be just a real crime. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here with this, because this is the standard in America, right? Have your, your house, whether it's this big or not, have your lawn, whether it's this big or not. And, I see this all across the country, this literal exact thing, whether I'm in, New Jersey where I live, or if I'm traveling to California, or I'm in Illinois, or I'm in Maine, or I'm in Arizona. This is what I see. And, quite frankly, I hate it. It's dead. This does not support anything. And it is resource intensive. It's polluting. Really nothing lives here other than the people. And they don't even use all of that space, right? So my challenge to you is, if you want to help bees, and specifically our native bees and all the other wildlife, let's commit to shifting away from this and more to something like this. There's still some lawn there, hopefully not being sprayed with pesticides and polluting fertilizers and whatever. But if we all converted some of our lawn, some of our yards, into beds that are densely planted, filled with blooming native plants that bloom, some in the spring, some in the summer, some in the fall, that are going to provide food and cover and places to raise young. And then you throw in, a little bird bath and a mud puddle, and you have, water resources for our native bees. We can really turn the tide on the declines of some of these disappearing bee species and other pollinators. And it's beautiful, right? I mean, we're gardeners. We love plants as much as we love wildlife, right? So why not fill our yards with as many beautiful blooming native plants as possible, right? It's such a win-win. And, at the National Wildlife Federation, we sort of encourage folks to shoot for a goal of 50 to 70% native plants on your property. That's where you really start to see the big impacts on pollinator populations and other wildlife. And the research shows that when you do this, it actually works. Like, this isn't just like, oh, try this out and we hope it'll work. The research shows that when you create a native plant-based landscape, you're going to see 50% more wildlife. And again, insects are wildlife, pollinators, bees are wildlife. 50% more, not just in, individual animals, but 50% more in the diversity of species anyway. So it's really powerful when you do this. And so I'm going to leave you with a few inspirational pictures. These are all people's yards. They're beautiful landscapes filled with beautiful blooming native plants from all different regions. You can do this anywhere in the country. Again, all those different states, radically different plant communities. Just plant what's native where you are. Garden for Wildlife can get you the plants that are native to where you live, that are going to support the bees. And if we all did that, again, we can turn the tide on these awful wildlife declines. So real quick, some resources. Visit the National Wildlife Federation's, our native plant habitat website. It's nwf.org/garden. You guys, tons and tons of resources on here. I'll just highlight a few of them. We've got the Native Plant Finder. You put in your zip code. We will give you a list of the top keystone native plants in terms of the numbers of butterflies and moths that they support, as well as native bees, and as well as songbirds. So definitely go check that out. You'll get a nice shopping list out of this. Of course, go to gardenforwildlife.com. there who is hosting us tonight. They have developed these curated lines of native plants. They've done all the work for you. They're really a spin-off of the National Wildlife Federation. So when I say they, I really mean us. We work together to create this program and bring it. So it is fueled by the expertise of us as wildlife conservationists putting these plant lists together. Just a snapshot of my Garden for Wildlife plant lists that are available to me here in New Jersey. And of course, when you do this, what we really hope you do is join the movement by getting your yard or your garden certified. The wildlife, the bees, they cannot read the sign. So it's, they don't care about it. The most important thing to them is that you plant the natives and you don't use the pesticides and all the things we've been talking about. But when you do certify it, it really does help. It, again, increases the numbers of people that we can say are interested in gardening for wildlife, and that really helps us advocate for all of these efforts to make a difference and get more native plants out there available and so on and so forth. It's also kind of neat to be able to put the sign out and brag to your neighbors about it. So we've got these yard signs, these plaques, we've got smaller signs, we've got garden flags. No matter where you live, you can do this. You can do it not just in your own yard, you can do it at your kid's school, you can do it at your office, you can do it at the park. All of these spaces are eligible to be certified by the National Wildlife Federation. So yeah, find us on social media. Both the National Wildlife Federation and Garden for Wildlife are on all of these platforms. I am as well. So I'm D Mizajewski on most of them. Write down my name or do a screenshot so you can type it out and find me. I love interacting with folks on social, so shoot me your questions there. And one last shameless plug for my book, Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. It's a how-to book. It'll walk you through how to do all of this, and a portion of the proceeds go right back into supporting the work of the National Wildlife Federation. So with that, I'm going to stop and take questions. I know we're right up at 7 o'clock here, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right, Julie, help me with questions here. I'm sure you've been spotting a whole bunch of them.
Yes. So I put a lot of those links in the chat while you were running through them. And then there are a couple of questions that I have pinned that we can cover. I think you answered the ones about honeybees. I thought you might cover those topics. So we're not going to address those questions. I did see one previously about bees and like native bees and non-native bees in the same garden. Is there a concern around that?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, look, we love honeybees, right? Honeybees are important. They are agriculturally important. And many people keep them as hobbyists, right? And I would just, my suggestion is just try to frame it in your mind the same way that a lot of people like to keep backyard chickens because they enjoy them and they get eggs from them, right? And sometimes they get meat from them. Keeping a backyard honeybee hive is the same thing, right? But it is not wildlife conservation and it's not helping pollinator decline. And yes, in some senses, it could be hurting the native bee population because again, honeybees can introduce disease to our native bees. And because they are polyelectric, which means that they are the generalist type bee species, they are out there visiting every flower everywhere. And there is some evidence that they can push away and outcompete some of our native bees. So I'm not saying hate honeybees, that we should banish honeybees, get rid of honeybees. I just think we need to frame them and understand what they are and what they aren't. And so if you are interested in helping support native wild pollinators and supporting the ecosystem, focus first on planting native plants and supporting the native bee population.
Yeah, so I found the question was from Sandra, and she specifically said that the neighbors down the street keep bees. Is there a way to deter the honeybees from visiting the pollinator garden? I don't want them taking resources from the native insects.
Yeah, I understand the question and the sentiment behind it. We don't have to be that militant, right? I mean, and quite frankly, there's nothing you can do to keep the honeybees out while still supporting. But I would flip that because the really good thing is that, anything that is going to attract a honeybee is also going to support our native bees too. Honeybees don't want pesticides. They want to see a landscape filled with blooming plants. So even if people are, trying to support honeybees, those actions are largely going to be supporting native bees too. So.
Mm-hmm. I saw a few questions about mosquito dunks.
Yeah.
And I think one was saying that they put them in the bird bath water. I don't know
Yeah.
if
So
what
mosquito
do you know about
dunks.
mosquito dunks and potential harm to native bees, other wildlife?
Yeah, there isn't. There won't be. So mosquito dunks, mosquito bits are products that you can buy. They are basically a soil bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, one strain of which, Israeliensis, targets the larva of mosquitoes and fungus gnats and a couple other uh, insects in the fly family. And those larvae have to ingest it, and they're generally aquatic or soil bound, right? So if a honeybee, or I'm sorry, if a native bee, number one, it wouldn't ever ingest that, and number two, it would have no effect on it. And that's one of the beauties of that type of pesticide, because it is a pesticide, but it is considered an organic pesticide, and it's super targeted. And so, if anybody is interested in learning more about that, again, go to the National Wildlife Federation and just Google mosquitoes. And I have written a whole bunch of stuff about the mosquito dunks and other ways to minimize getting bitten without having to spray pesticides. I see some questions about carpenter bees. So
I'm seeing
carpenter
those
bees.
too. I was going to ask that question next. So yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
so carpenter bees are wonderful, big, giant bees that do bore into wood, right? They are one of the species that is using dead trees in nature to lay their eggs. And yeah, they can actually be a little bit of a pest situation in our buildings, right? But let's frame this. Number one, they're seeking rotting wood. And so first they're going to be looking for that softwood. Like, can they drill into fresh wood? Yes. Does it happen sometimes? Yes. But generally, they're looking for that old rotting wood. And I have a house that's almost 100 years old, and I have carpenter bees. And I am actually this weekend have the contractors coming because we're going to be repainting, and they're going to be pulling out the rotting wood with the carpenter bees in it, and those bees are going to go away. And we're going to replace it. We're going to paint it, and that's going to happen, right? Um, I'm not suggesting that you should let your house get destroyed by carpenter bees. But here's the thing: is that carpenter bees are not going to destroy your house, right? So first and foremost, house maintenance, right? Like, keep up with your house maintenance, and you'll be less likely to attract them in the first place. Carpenter bees are not declining, and they're not disappearing, most of them, to my knowledge. So it's not the end of the world if you have to off a few of them. I wouldn't go out of your way to do it, though. And there are things that you can do to deter them. So if you have them boring into the wood in your yard, you can put screening over top that will keep them out, at least from accessing the hole, which they will revisit. Or other bees will reuse those holes. I have also heard, and this is anecdotal, I have not tested this or seen science behind it, but I've heard from multiple sources that almond essential oil, if you dab that on a rag or put some in a spray bottle and spray it over the area, that the scent of it will actually deter them. So carpenter bees are native bees. They're important pollinators. Again, they're not really going to sting you. The ones that buzz in your face that seem really aggressive are actually the males that are territorial, trying to like keep their turf so they can mate with the females. And they get kind of bossy and they'll fly right up in your face and people freak out. They can't even sting you. So hopefully that helps a little bit with the carpenter bee issue. And yes, so the mosquito dunk and the bucket. So the other thing you can look up is the mosquito bucket of doom. This is something that's been championed by Dr. Doug Tallamy, who is a good friend of Garden for Wildlife and National Wildlife Federation. He's a scientist that has done a lot of the research that I shared with you today on the impacts of native plants in our landscapes on pollinators. And so the idea is that mosquitoes breed in basically stagnant water. So what you're going to do is you get a 5-gallon bucket and you put some straw in there or hay or some kind of plant material that's going to break down, and it puts off some gases that are going to simulate like stagnant water, and it's going to draw the female mosquitoes in, and they're going to lay their eggs in that bucket. But then what you're going to do is you're going to inoculate the water with the mosquito dunk or the mosquito bits with that Bacillus thuringiensis or Israeliensis BTI bacterium, and it's going to kill all the mosquitoes that are in there. And if you do that, basically what it does is it becomes a sink for the mosquito population. So if you eliminate standing water around your property, clean your gutters, corrugated pipes, that you might have on your downspouts. Those hold little pools of water. Those are bad. Tons of mosquitoes breed in them. If you have a bird bath that you never empty, empty and clean that. Eliminate the breeding areas everywhere else. Stick the bucket of doom in the back corner of your property, and all the mosquitoes are going to go there, and then you're going to kill them. And it's 100% natural and organic. So look that up. We're really advocating for more and more people doing that, because more and more people are hiring mosquito companies to come spray their yards and killing everything. So I know we're over time, so I want to be respectful for that. I'm happy to hang for a few more minutes, though, Julie, if you have more questions.
Yeah, actually, I saw a couple comments. I'm just going to pull this one that came in about clovers, because I saw a few people talk about this as you were doing the presentation. They have field of white clover and they see bees all over it. What can you tell us about the clover, David?
Yeah, so I mean, clover is a great alternative to the conventional lawn, right? Or a lawn with clover in it. I think of this as kind of a continuum, right? On the one hand, you have wild nature, preferably with mostly native plants, right? Supporting the diversity of wildlife, that kind of thing. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a monoculture lawn of one kind of grass that is doused in pesticides and, herbicides and insecticides and, tons of chemical fertilizers that run off into the watershed, right? And it's a dead zone. It's like that picture I showed you, right? So having a lawn with clover is much better than having that monoculture lawn, right? And clover is going to provide nectar, definitely for honeybees, probably bumblebees, maybe even some native bees. And it's actually going to fix nitrogen and return nitrogen to the soil. So you'll have to fertilize less or not at all, because nitrogen is the key component in fertilizer. But what's even better than having clover in your lawn is having less lawn filled with native plants. You follow me there? So, again, it's not a black and white answer. I'm not going to say no clover or yes clover, right? It's like no mow May, right? Not mowing your lawn is better than mowing it, but it's much better to get rid of the lawn in the first place. So hopefully that helps too.
I'm going to grab just one more question, if that's
Okay.
So a few people asked, what do we do to help the rusty patch bumblebee? And I linked to a resource in response from the, what is it? Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah.
But can you talk about that? Like, what flowers do they need?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Off the top of my head, I don't know. I mean, they're a bumblebee, and bumblebees are polygalactic, so they are generalists. So I would say probably just planting lots and lots of natives is going to be your best bet. Don't spray pesticides. I mean, it's everything I told you already. But I will add something, and that is, if we want to help species that are endangered, we need to have good, solid, science-based policy and legislation. And it's just the reality. That's how we do a lot of our conservation work in the conservation space. So like if we didn't have the Endangered Species Act, the rusty patch bumblebee would already be extinct, right? So we're in a time where, politics being what they are, a lot of these wildlife protection laws are under fire. Science is under fire and being devalued. And so I think that's something else we can all do. We can stand up for conservation and for good science fueling conservation. Because without it, the bald eagle would be gone. The red wolf would already be gone. And a lot of our pollinators would also be gone, including the monarch butterfly, which is proposed to be listed for protection as a threatened species. But the feet are being dragged on that year after year. So I don't know what will happen with that. But anyway, that's an honest answer.
Yeah, we are waiting on the protection for the monarch butterfly. But in the meantime, we can plant native milkweed and nectar plants to help the butterfly and the other pollinators, and we can cut back on the pesticides.
Yeah. And the last comment that just came in, I just want to, maybe we'll end there. This is all about think globally, act locally, you guys. That old tried and true environmentalist, credo that probably came out in the 60s. It really is true. All of this garden for wildlife stuff, protecting pollinators, it really is about thinking about the planet's health and then doing what you can in your own space, your own piece of the earth. Like I said, your garden, your yard, your neighborhood. If we all did that, and we can do it, like we can do this. This is also achievable, right? I mean, none of the stuff that I talked about tonight is difficult. And especially today. I mean, when I first started at the National Wildlife Federation 26 years ago, um, it was like we didn't have resources. We didn't have Garden for Wildlife, like where you could just go online and have these native plants delivered to you, And so it we're making big steps forward, and I think I want to leave you with that note of encouragement and positivity because again, like we have the power to change this, and it starts with our own actions. So yeah, I think with that we'll probably wrap.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. Fun fact that I didn't share. This photo in the background is a bumblebee on my lobelia plant that I got from Garden for Wildlife. So there you see conservation in action.
There you go. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. Happy World Bee Day and happy Garden for Wildlife Month. And I hope you check out all the National Wildlife Federation's resources and get all your native plants from Garden for Wildlife.
Yes, please. All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye, everyone.